Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 NASSP Advocacy Conference. I am so pleased to be able to kick off this wonderful conference. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Motley. I am the very proud principal of Atholton High School in Columbia, Maryland, and the current president of NASSP. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us today. Believe me, I understand how busy you all are, and I know the pandemic has only made our days longer and harder. In fact, I'm speaking to you today from Atholton with our hybrid group A of about 275 students in the building. I like to tell people that schools have not been closed, but the buildings have. I know that you and your staff have been working tirelessly over the past 13 months to address the unprecedented challenges the COVID-19 pandemic presented, including inequitable digital access, diminished learning opportunities, growing food insecurity, and numerous impacts to our students' and educators' well-being. Because of our role in all of these aspects of education and our communities, principals are very well positioned to tell legislators exactly what schools and systems need. We have knowledge and experience that no one else has. It's incumbent upon us to share that information with our representatives, senators, assembly people, governors, and agency officials. But you all know this, and thanks to you and your advocacy, the American Rescue Plan was recently signed into law by President Biden. This law is delivering $125 billion in emergency funding for schools, with an additional $7 billion to close the homework gap by providing home internet access to families with poor connectivity. Now, there is a robust national discussion about investment in infrastructure, and NASSP is very pleased to hear that education is part of that discussion. Too many schools are way overdue for facilities improvements that will make them healthy and safe places to learn. Like the American Rescue Plan, we need to make sure school leaders have a voice in this infrastructure discussion as Congress considers the investment in our communities and schools. We will explore these topics and much more this afternoon, including hearing from our U.S. Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, who will be answering some of the questions you submitted prior to this event. So get comfortable, get that water and coffee, and even though we're not together in one room, I hope you engage in today's conversation. Now, we'll get started with our first session about the state of American education. We are fortunate to have as moderator, journalist Nirvi Shah. Nirvi is Senior Deputy Editor for Policy with Politico Pro and founded the Politico Pro Education Policy team. Prior to joining Politico, Nirvi worked as Special Education and School Climate and Culture Reporter at Education Week, covering school safety, health, discipline, and nutrition. She is one of the premier journalists covering education policy today. Nirvi, thank you for moderating today, and please take us away.
Thank you so much for a very generous introduction. I really appreciate that, and I'm excited to be here today. There's so much going on in the education world, and you all are all living that every single day. So welcome to all of you that are joining us from your schools or your campuses, and welcome to our esteemed panelists. I'm excited to have this conversation today. We have a great group of people to talk about and answer some of the questions about new money that Washington has sent to our schools to address the pandemic, how to use that money to create an equitable recovery, since we all know that the crisis has hit some communities far harder than others. And we want to talk about what's ahead for next school year as well. And finally, we'll talk about your advocacy and some of the best practices related to that advocacy, because I know that's what some of you all are here to talk about this week in particular. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Let's get started. In our agendas, there's more detailed information about each of your guests today, but very briefly, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill of New Jersey, Dr. Jennifer McCormick, the former State Superintendent of Indiana, and Principal Richard Gordon of Philadelphia, who is also the 2021 NASSP National Principal of the Year. Let's jump right in. I'd like to first start off talking about the American Recovery Plan and what that will bring to schools. Congress passed $5.3 trillion in emergency spending to respond, to bolster the economy, to ease the burden faced by Americans. And as we just heard, it's $170 billion for schools. Congresswoman Sherrill, you sit on the House Education and Labor Committee. As lawmakers were crafting this plan, what did you view as the most critical needs for schools that had to be addressed through this legislation?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to hear from Dr. McCormick and Richard Gordon about what they're seeing on the ground. But I have to say, from my point of view as both a legislator and a mom of 4 school-age kids, my youngest is in 3rd grade and my oldest is a freshman in high school. Yesterday marked the first day my elementary school children attended in-school learning for over a year. And my high school and middle school children have not been able to go into in-person learning since March 12th of last year. So to me, the biggest, the most important thing the ARP had to do was get kids back into in-person learning through making sure teachers are vaccinated, making sure schools have the resources that they need, both the infrastructure that our schools need. Some of the schools, for example, I'm in New Jersey, in my area are very, very old. And then also with the educational support. Our teachers, as I'm sure everyone on this panel knows, are exhausted. They've been overstressed. Families are exhausted. I know, I wish I could tell you that my husband and I had both, when we have gotten notes over the past year from teachers about how our children were failing to perform certain tasks, that we were gracious and generous and, oh, thank you so much. But there have definitely been days where we've both been like, well, what do you expect us to do? This, and the teachers, I think, are like, I don't know what you expect me to do. I mean, we're all just incredibly stressed. And the impact on children not being in the classroom has been great. We've seen that when we've seen a CDC study that found that emergency department visits that were mental health related increased by approximately 24% for children aged 5 to 11, 31% for children aged 12 to 17 from 2019 to 2020. We know that children who require special education services are deeply impacted, worse than many of the other children throughout my district, at least. An analysis of fall 2020 standardized testing found that students learning in math over the past year has been 33% less than expected, reading 13% less. And we know that these are impacting many of our underserved communities even worse. A fall 2020 study from Brookings found that 67% of Black students, 67% of Hispanic students, and 71% of Asian students were in remote-only school districts compared to just 53% of white students. And we also know that the CDC has said that our schools are not where the virus is being transmitted. So to the extent that we can ensure that we have the good HVAC systems, that we have the resources for students to be in school safely and for teachers to be vaccinated, that is what we need to be striving to do. The ARP gives the schools those resources to do just that. The one thing I would say, my concern right now is that we have got to get, and we've been pushing, my office has been pushing Treasury to get the regulations out, because if we are going to have school districts make use of the ARP funding to get schools into some of the summer enrichment programs that I think that they need, that money needs to be going out now. You can't, certainly you can't give it to a school in June and say, and what are you doing this summer? These programs need to be set up right now.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect segue into my next question, which is for Dr. McCormick and Mr. Gordon, Principal Gordon, about how the money that has been distributed, what has actually trickled down to states, both from the CARES Act and ARP, has actually been allocated. How is that money being put to use? And I would guess that both of you would say that there's still a need to be met despite what has already been provided.
ladies first.
Thank you, Principal Gordon. I was going to let you jump in there because I know your boots on the ground, but I'm happy to go. First of all, to the panelists, it's my honor to be with you today. I know the great work that many of you are doing, and I appreciate this opportunity. To NASSP, thank you for having me. Appreciate that as well. But most importantly, to all of you who are in attendance, who are the leaders in our buildings across the nation, I cannot thank you enough. It has been since March of over a year now. It has been, I would say, one of the most challenging, if not the most challenging times ever in our profession. I know, having been a principal and superintendent and state superintendent, I can't even imagine the local lens of this. So thank you for your work. It is noticed, it is appreciated. We don't hear it enough, but just know, you need to take care of yourselves as well. But thank you for everything you're doing. From the state lens of how the federal funds are working, first of all, thank you. Congresswoman Sherrill, your support on this, thank you. Not all of our Congress folks were as maybe as supportive, but I do want to say thank you to those who were, and President Biden's team for getting it done. It's critical. Schools have to have this support. Schools are trying to be really smart about how to plan this out as far as investing wisely, looking at how to address the barriers they're facing, but also being pretty creative on what are some of the opportunities that going forward. We are fully aware that this money's got to outlast the federal aid. And so I will say people are busy planning. To the principals, hopefully, your superintendents, your central offices are including you in that planning, and you're including educators in the classrooms and your support staff in that planning. It's going to take everyone, but I do commend local schools for how they're being very aggressive and very smart with how they use this money. I will also caution that I am hopeful that most states are not taking the approach of the feds are giving you X, so we're taking away Y. And I know that was not the intent, but I will tell you that is happening. So that's frustrating for many of us who are the practitioners who are trying to move forward and recoup and grow and move on into those next steps. But that is something that I know is happening, and I would caution folks of that. Principal Gordon.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of our guests. I'm honored to be here with the NASSP. And again, thank you for my esteemed panelists and our hosts for having me here as well. One of the things that has been happening is information being gathered from the ranks of the teachers and from the principals, just making suggestions and recommendations on how this money is going to be spent. As of right now, the only sure plans that have been really laid down is what are some of the enrichment and some of the remediation programs that are going to be put in place to support our students with regards to the academic gaps that have clearly been affecting our students over the course of the last 12 months. Philadelphia has been in virtual since March 13th, March 12th, for the most part. So it's been basically a full year where our students have been on Zoom, and they're zoomed out, and we've also noticed a huge increase in the number of mental health cases. I have seen my honor roll students, turn around and have a lot of suicidal ideations. And so what I'm hoping that this funding will provide is an opportunity for us to address the reasons why we are still virtual. And so the number one reason, particularly in Philadelphia and a lot of urban communities across the country, is because of the state of our facilities. In Philadelphia, for example, we have a $4 billion liability when it comes to our facilities, in order for us to be able to bring everything up to code. That's a result of, unfortunately, one administration after another kicking the can down the road because, we were so highly prioritizing what was happening with our test scores, and also with this, explosion of charter schools that have been happening in our area, that unfortunately we've not taken the time to actually take on the issue of what's happening with our facilities and providing our students a great environment to motivate and facilitate their learning. And so it is our hopes that, at least in Philadelphia, my hopes, I'll say, that's one of the primary things that we start to address, because unfortunately, until we have an opportunity to be able to fix that problem, our teachers are going to continue to opt out of the in-person options that we are providing now. Right now, the option is you have the option of coming in person if you're, through, grades, elementary school up until about 9th grade. 10 through 12, unfortunately, will not be coming back this year. But we've noticed also that a lot of our families are not opting into in-person because, again, we're still having the issue of, ventilation concerns, air transitions, and all the science things that happens with regards to how COVID is spread. And unfortunately, we've not addressed how our facilities really helps to protect us from that spread. And until we get a chance to really deal with that, I think we're going to continue to see the same problem of our families opting out of in-person learning, which in turn will continue this academic gap that our students are experiencing.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up question? So the students that have been able to go back, how did they prepare those facilities, or how is the school district addressing the students that do want to come back and making the building safe? And do they have, is the district using the federal money, or how did they pay for those changes?
Well, so some is federal money, and also some is money that was allocated through the state as well. So there was always a process in place to have our elementary school students come back. And so there was the debate that was happening here in Philadelphia, and you can see this online, where they were instituting fans in in a lot of our classrooms. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to actually do some work with the Environmental Protection Agency and learn about some of the science behind air transitions. Testify in front of City Council here in Philadelphia to talk about how it's important to really treat our schools the same way you treat a lot of our restaurant businesses. One of the challenges that was happening was that they were asking our restaurants, when they were opening up to 50% capacity, to have 15 air transitions per hour, but yet they were only requiring the schools to have 3 to 4. That just was unacceptable. And so in a fan system where even you'd be lucky to get to 2 and 3 air transitions, and we're just trying to explain to everyone the difference between an air transition and just moving air around in the room. And so because if you're moving air around the room, those particles, those bacteria, those germs are still in the area, but it's the transitions of cleaning the air for those transitions were the ones that was going to protect individuals from actually spreading COVID in small confined spaces. And so we had to have those conversations as well. So they switched, and they want them actually switching over from fans to now air purifiers to actually help with the air transition piece, so that we can at least have a lot more protection in our classrooms. So because that transition is still in progress, we're still trying to address that at the high school level, because the announcement for 9th graders to come back into high schools was just announced last week. So as of Monday, our teachers will be returning back to the building on Monday. We'll have about a 2-week transition period, and then our students will have an opportunity to take advantage of hybrid learning starting on May 10th through the end of the school year, to at least have the opportunity to be able to transition our 9th graders, get to know them, because we haven't met them, for the most part, other than Zoom, and really provide them an opportunity to learn about the program, we learn about them, and get a sense of what high school is like.
Representative Sherrill, if I heard you correctly, your oldest is a freshman in high school this year, so they may be experiencing that same thing where they haven't necessarily met their teachers in person. And speaking of infrastructure, I was curious to ask about the American Jobs Plan, which would provide, should it pass, $100 billion in direct funding for school facilities. And I'd love for you to talk about that, the current condition of our school buildings. It sounds like it's an issue, obviously, in New Jersey as well. What will this plan really do, and what are the prospects for this legislation?
I think after over a year, I'd be better at unmuting myself. Yeah, certainly. New Jersey actually has the best public schools in the nation. That comes at a cost. We invest heavily in our public school education. That said, even though our buildings in large part have been better funded than across the nation, we still have a huge amount of debt and needed investment in our school buildings. So the American Jobs Plan would help with that. And then I think we have to really address going forward. I think Dr. McCormick was right. She's looking at this investment and saying, how is this going to last us? Because the investments made now, we have to be thinking of the future. This feels like a very innovative time. It feels like an opportunity for our schools right now. We're not sure what the future holds, but we do need to make those investments now so that our schools are prepared to handle and accommodate our students for the next several decades. What is the future going to look like? However, we do have legacy concerns. We have schools in New Jersey with lead problems that need to be addressed. We have schools across the nation where children are learning in transient quarters, trailers, and we know that that's not only a problem for our students, but that's a problem for teacher retention when they don't have a great workplace to go to. So these investments are not only going to enable us to fix some of the current problems in our schools, but these should be down payments on the future of the buildings that our children are going to need. And I just, you know, I really, I think what Principal Gordon said was so important in an understanding of this. And what's been so troubling is that we haven't had a national mandate as we have worked over the past year and change about how, you know, what do we need to do to provide a safe learning space for our schools? What does the air transition need to look like? And as we've learned, I think because there has been some distrust and different narratives over what the science says and what we should believe in, it's become harder and harder. I know Principal Gordon and I were talking for just a few minutes, and so many, once we do get the buildings ready to go, so many of our families now mistrust that. If you sort of miss that opportunity to get teachers and students back in school here in the Northeast, really in September when we had very low caseloads, people have not felt comfortable then. We haven't provided a comfortable space, so it's really incumbent upon us to talk to students and teachers about how important it is to get our kids back into in-person school, how mentally and socially damaging it is for our children not to be in school, and why we think it's safe. And part of that has to do with our vaccine programs. Part of that has to do with our investment in our schools. And then finally, again, for our summer learning, I know in some of our older school districts, and I know Principal Gordon and I are both in some of the oldest areas of the country, many of our buildings don't have air conditioning. So finding those spaces for children to do summer learning is also going to be a cost to our school districts.
If I may, I'm sorry.
Please.
Because I'm currently sitting in a building that has no air conditioning, my school. And I can attest to the quality of New Jersey schools because I'm a proud graduate of Pennsauken High School. So I just want to put that out there. But one of the things I just want to, but I also just want to be able to say, yes, it has to be about long range planning at this point. And I want to go back to something that Dr. McCormick had mentioned before about the cautions related to this funding also. And I just would caution that part of the long range planning has to be something that's a comprehensive approach of all stakeholders, because we have to, for Philadelphia, for example, and I'm just, going back on my own experiences, the stimulus money and funding that we received back in 2010 under the Obama administration, was something that was spent. There was nothing long-term. It was spent on positions that were one-shot deals that could not be sustained. And we wound up actually going into a free fall, because what happened was when that money was perceived to be misspent, the next administration when it comes at the governor, and of course we had a change in Congress, in control of Congress, and that funding dried up. And unfortunately, it sent Philadelphia into a tailspin with regards to funding. And so I would caution everyone to be very aware of the lessons from, 10, 12 years ago about how it's so important that we make sure we spend this money correctly, that it's sustainable. I had the pleasure of actually visiting in 2013 how a different approach was made by Nashville, Tennessee schools, where they invested in buildings and they comprehensively renovated every single comprehensive building that was in their school district, and created, and developed a sustainable programs that would serve generation after generation of students to come. And my understanding is that those programs are still in place till this day, and it was based off of money that they got from the federal government back in 2010.
Dr. McCormick, I'd love to pick up on that point with you as well. And I see some questions where people are asking about, preventing that the funding from being used for something, that the state was going to pay for, and instead of actually supplementing what is available at the local level, it'll actually override that amount. And I wanted to talk to you about that. And I also wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about the school facilities, but obviously the delivery of instruction has changed dramatically over the course of the last year. And what will we see about rethinking the way that delivery is happening, even when kids are back in school? What should change, if anything? Standardized testing, all of those kinds of things. I'd love to talk about that next. But I think there's a lot of interest in what you said about local dollars being used for something else in place of these federal dollars.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is this spending, for lack of better words, isn't sexy spending. And what I mean by that, it's boxes and wires and infrastructure and pipes and energy savings products and roofs. And I hope, there's always that challenge or that desire to do something that's shiny and new, and that's really not the intent per se of these dollars. And I think people are going to have to do some real soul searching, because sometimes that's what the community wants to see, but yet there's so many, as you've heard from everybody who's on the call, there's so many needs that are basic that we need to focus on so we can go forward. But with the impact aid piece of it, the expenditures that are allowed in that arena for schools, I think it's also a great opportunity to address some of our safety issues that we're seeing across the nation on how do we retrofit, how do we outfit some of our districts that have police departments or heavy SROs, or some that just may have a very light touch in that arena. But how do we maximize these dollars for that, I think is also an extremely important conversation. Indiana, I know we're not unique in this, but there are several states that we've been in. 95% of our districts have been in for a long time. Now, that doesn't always look pretty. Some of that's a hybrid. Some of that is, our elementary's in, our high school had to go out for 2 weeks. And so it's been very in and out. Some districts have just been in-person K-12 period and heavy quarantine. So I know there's a lot of that going on too, but regardless of the method or the operation or the platform of instruction, I think going forward, it will change instructional practices. I think it has given us the reason and the urgency of why to look at those learning management systems differently, to make sure our infrastructure is beefy enough to handle, to understand why it's necessary to modernize our computer lab, or not necessarily computer labs, but our chemistry labs and our physics labs, and some of those programs that have needed some financial assistance forever, and how do we take advantage of this opportunity. But the instructional piece, obviously, I don't think that the need or the want for a heavier presence of online options going to go away. I will say that with a little bit of caution that some of the results we're getting aren't great on that end of things, but also it has fit a need for some of our students who have had the benefit to go work or have had the benefit of taking advantage of some family dynamics that it allowed them to, or illness, or whatever the case may be. So many districts going forward are gearing up to say, how do we embrace that, but do it in a smarter way where it's an offering, but it's not monopolizing the conversation. The instructional practice too, if anything, for Indiana, we've used it as, see, we told you that in-person was the best way to learn and how valuable it is, and now we have to take care of it. And I know across the nation, people are having that conversation, understanding that for some of our population of students and families, that online piece is important to offer.
Just to follow up on that too, there's a lot of concern that this year that people have talked about learning loss. There are clearly some ways to measure that learning loss. Both Representative Sherrill and Dr. McCormick, you both mentioned that. But people are pretty concerned about the federal standardized testing requirement that still stands for most states. I mean, obviously, I think there's a small rollout of waivers by the Federal Department of Education that is coming. But should we rethink that? And what should we do for this year because the learning loss is also something that we need to get a handle on. How do we reconcile those two things? And I open it to anyone.
Can I please jump on this one? So
we're all ready to jump on that one.
Yes, exactly. Because this is a real sticking point for me, because one of the challenges that I have with standardized testing is the fact that it's being used to make decisions about the future of schools and the circumstances in which schools exist. As I mentioned before, you look at my bio, you know that Robeson High School is one of the schools that was actually slated for closure before I arrived. And it was based on a lot of the metrics, but one of the main metrics was standardized testing. And so now here we are in the middle of a pandemic, looking to actually test kids who have been virtual for approximately 9 to 12 months. And we're expecting that we're going to get positive results from our students who are struggling with so many other issues, academically, but also personally as well. Again, we go back to the mental health increases, the increases in suicidal ideations, the increase of students who are adultified because they had to go out and actually work to support the households. And we're having conversations around standardized testing at the end of the year when we're still trying to figure out how to do remediation for summer learning. And so I think that it would be, antithetical to what we stand for when it comes to education if we move forward with the idea that we're going to start testing kids at the end of the school year, when really the idea is figuring out how are we going to stabilize our school systems to the point where we can use remediation and summer learning over the summer to continue to reinforce and stabilize kids to get them prepared for in-person in September, because we got to get our kids back on solid ground.
Well, and I will say in Indiana, we challenged our leaders, we challenged our teachers, our support staff, our school boards. You need to be innovative through this process. You need to make it work. But when we challenged the same thing on the end of assessment, state mandated assessment or federally mandated assessments, that was not reciprocated. So to operate under completely unknown situations, but want the testing to go as usual or as normal is, to me, very short-sighted. It is very, it truly reflects how the big donor dollars are tied to, like in Indiana alone, it's $60 million business. But there are other ways to assess where kids are. I'm not anti-assessment, I'm not anti-accountability, but there are just clearly other ways to do it. And with the situation we're in, we need to allow some flexibility at that state level in order to move forward. But I agree with Principal Gordon. This is not the time. This is not the year. It's nonsensical some results we're to get, but to me, it's very short-sighted that we're even entertaining national statewide testing.
And with families opting out of in-person learning because of again, I think Congressman Sherrill mentioned the trust factor about our families trusting us to keep them safe. And now we're also eroding the trust factor because unfortunately there's a certain motivation and morale that comes with students who know that when they get their performance numbers back and they realize that they didn't perform as well as they wanted to, again, we're just furthering piling on for our families and our students, unfortunately. And that trust factor has to be a huge consideration.
To follow up on that, as you've all mentioned, there's the trust factor, and the trust factor is very different for different families. So there's the equity gaps that existed before the pandemic have only been just magnified by this pandemic and the way that kids are going back to school or they're receiving that instruction. Representative Sherrill, are there ways that federal policy can change to address some of these issues? I mean, how can we, whether it's through money that's already allocated, but other actual policy changes that the federal government can consider to address some of this?
Yeah, so one of the most striking things I think that this pandemic has pointed out is so many of the areas that we were looking to invest in, that we were concerned about across the nation during the pandemic really came to a crisis point. So by that, I'm talking about things like high-speed internet and access. We knew that we were slowly getting to a point in this country of haves and have-nots, where people that had access to high-speed internet, that had facility on computers, were going to have a world open to them that those children that had no engagement with that were going to be totally left behind in so many jobs of the future. And yet, you know, and as we talked about that, there was this sense, especially from some of our rural communities, some of our underserved communities, you know, many of us have been advocating for this, but it really was the pandemic that I think brought this into such sharp relief as we tried to go online. And you know, you had families where even families, you'd say, well, why didn't your school district give computers to the families? Well, we did. And then we found sometimes that, you know, we didn't give it up. You know, the kids were sharing them, or one kid could get on at one time and one at another time. Or even if we gave people computers, they didn't have the high-speed internet. So the Zoom was glitching. And then even if we can get kids with high-speed internet and a computer, I have to tell you, I have a third grader. And my husband and I both have been working throughout the pandemic. And without support, without our babysitter who started to come in to help her out, I don't know how often my daughter would have been sitting there in front of the Zoom. Now she's very good at Zoom. She's probably better than I am. And I had a lot of sympathy for that lawyer that had the cat face and couldn't get it on, because I have a suspicion that all my kids know how to do a little cat face on Zoom, and I could not get rid of that if I had been in that position. But so she has a lot of facility at it now, but she really needed some hand holding and some reminders to stay in her seat and to, you know, and I would be upstairs working on my Zoom and she'd be in the room and, you know, what are you doing here? She's in the middle class, you know. So we also know that that even facility with Zoom and even understanding from parents and from, you know, supporters has been such a huge thing. So when we look at the needs for our students, I think this learning loss was something that I know President Biden was talking about during his campaign, and the way we address this, some of the ways we address this are near term, but some of the ways are very long term. So we put direct funding to our most underserved school districts to help students catch up through tutoring, through enrichment programs, through summer classes. We've set aside 20% of the $130 billion for K through 12 for underserved communities specifically. We know that in other national funding we saw, for example, in small business loans, when we weren't concerned about small and underserved businesses, many of the more savvy businesses were able to get their lawyers on it much more quickly. So we've set aside money specifically for that purpose. In the long term, again, as we've been talking about, investments in new construction, repairs, maintenance of school facilities, and we invest $100 billion to make this a reality. We also need to make sure that we're investing in some proven programs. I've seen, because I worked in prisoner reentry, people coming out of federal prison, and the buzzword coming out of federal prison was always retraining. And we had a lot of, I don't want to say, but you know, sort of fly-by-night retraining programs that would take advantage of some federal funding, set up shop, and yet they would retrain, you know, they'd be supposedly retraining someone who had never had a smartphone to be an IT tech. We really need to make sure that we are focusing these support programs on programs that are actually going to address learning loss, actually meet the children where they are and ensure that they catch up. Because the one thing that keeps me up at night is the thought that there's that child out there who, because of this past year, because this 1 year of their life is now going to face a lifetime of underachievement and never catch up. And that's what I think keeps so many of us up at night, thinking, how do we make sure that that child doesn't suddenly just get left behind for the rest of their life, decades of underachievement because of this 1 year. And that's what we're trying so hard to solve for right now.
I would say, in addition to the incredible stress that students have experienced, educators, from administrators to classroom teachers, have all experienced a lot of stress this year, regardless of how they were delivering learning, or if they had to, you know, suddenly shift to delivering learning in a way that they hadn't done before. There was a survey that I read recently that said more than a third of educators are thinking that because of the pandemic, they want to change their careers, and this is a career that's already, you know, perhaps in short of supply of teachers. I believe NASSP is advocating for the Save Education's Jobs Act, which would, establish a fund to really try to stabilize the education workforce. I'd like to ask you, Congresswoman, if you can also talk a little bit about that and how we can keep teachers in the classroom. And then, Dr. McCormick and Principal Gordon, I'd love to hear from you because you are probably seeing some of this frustration on the ground. There's also some questions in the chat about how some schools have remained open or been largely open. I think Indiana, that's the case throughout this pandemic. And I don't know what that has been like for some of these frontline educators. Have they been on board with this? That there's hesitation from other educators in other places in the country. How do we reconcile all of those things? And or are places where schools are reopening, is that a place where there's more attrition happening among educators? It's a lot to unpack. I realize I just put a bunch of stuff out there, but
Sure. So yeah, I would love to hear from Principal Gordon and Dr. McCormick because they're on the ground with this. But man, I think we have a huge attrition problem coming up if the experience of the last year is anything to go by. My third grader has an absolutely amazing teacher, Mrs. Klein, who she met for the very first time in person yesterday after being in her classroom for a year. And I told Miss Klein this story, and I was a little bit worried that she thought I was making it up, like just to somehow get in her good graces. But my daughter came home from school yesterday, and I said, "What was your favorite part of school?" And she said, "My teacher," which really surprised me. I mean, she's in third grade, so that seems like something like younger kids. But in third grade, you thought, "Oh, it'd be my friends," or this or that. But it was her teacher, and I said, "Well, what was it?" So Merritt had sent Ms. Klein a little tchotchke for Christmas, for the holidays, just, to thank her as a teacher. And Ms. Klein, and that was back in December, and Ms. Klein brought that into the classroom yesterday and said, "Merritt, I just so loved getting this." And Merritt was thrilled. And then she just, interacted with her. And I think just seeing her in person for the first time, somebody she'd only met on Zoom, was just so great. Ms. Klein obviously made all the kids feel wonderful to be back in the classroom. But so that's a great day. And I hope that gives her a lot of oomph to keep going in her profession because she's so good at it. But Ms. Klein has a young child herself, because I know she's struggled on the Zoom, and because we've talked, because I've struggled on Zoom with my kids. So she's dealing with a young child at home as she's trying to teach this class. She has had to get on my family because, as I mentioned, my daughter hasn't always been great about staying on Zoom. And, I got alerted that she was turning her camera off, or that she seemed to be watching something else while she was supposed to be on the Zoom. She was obviously completely disengaged, and we didn't know because she was in front of the computer. So she's had to get on us, and we've been stressed as well and trying to figure out what's going on. So it's been an incredibly difficult. I can't imagine doing that job with a young child at home. I can't imagine doing my job with anybody younger than a third grader. I mean, working parents are just kind of losing it. So she has made it through, and now now all of a sudden she has to be in the classroom. I'm sure her childcare was difficult to get set up at home as she's trying to make that transition. So how much is it going to take to make her want to come back in the fall? And what about all the other teachers that are experiencing the exact same thing? How many of them are just going to decide, I can't keep doing that. That was just, a really horrible year. And then I look at the misery, quite frankly, that I think is teaching middle school students on Zoom. I watch it and I just think, there, but for the grace of God, like, thank God that is not me right now, because those teachers are putting an incredible amount. They must be exhausted at the end of the day, because they are on Zoom. "Hey guys, how are you doing?" Blah, blah, blah. And then I hear my son, who is really a lovely, we'll chat with you, we'll tell you stuff. "Hey, how's it going?" And his fine. That's like it. That's all she can get out of it. And then I think, oh, what's he doing? But then I hear his friend, "Oh, hey, how are you? What did you do today?" Nothing. I'm thinking, oh dear God. So how are we going to teach how are we going to keep all of these teachers? I am really interested in hearing if it's different when we've kept teachers in person, I assume that they've had a huge struggle as well during COVID with everything going on. So I'm interested in hearing about that as well. But I know that the increasing difficulties in retaining teachers have strongly been linked to the reduction in state and local spending on education over the past decade. I know that we see that in when teachers are working in these remote trailers, that's tied to a difficulty in keeping our teachers. When we're not, investing in our education system, when we're not investing in our teachers, then we have a hard time keeping them. So hopefully these investments will help.
For us, we are very concerned. So we have 70% of our teachers that are under the age of 50. And why? And I say teachers, I mean certified educators. So I'm lumping principals, teachers, some of our school psychs, I mean licensed, certified folks. Why do I bring that up? Because those folks can move professions. They can, they have options. We lose, in our first 5 years, we lose a third of our teachers right now. And I know that's not a statistics that is unique to Indiana. So between year 1 and 5, a third of them actually leave teaching. So everyone in the nation should be paying attention to this. We have a high percentage that are retired. We have a high percentage of mobility now. So Indiana starts super early. So our school year will end at the end of May. So we're out of school at the end of May for most of our districts. And I will tell you, there is an administrative shuffle like no other right now. There's an incredible amount of retirements. There's an incredible amount of shuffling. For our teachers that have been in, they have not only taught in person, they've also taught on the platform of 100% online. So they have their online population they're responsible for. They have their in-person they're responsible for. And those kids who are hybrid Zooming at the same time. So they're teaching in person, they're teaching to their online at the same time, and they're also doing their 100% online. That is an incredible, that's a lot to ask of a professional. That is a lot to ask of someone to balance all of that. It's hard enough just to teach in person or to teach online, but to do it all. Also, principals really, I mean, it's a lot to lead in that environment. You're trying to lead those teachers who aren't necessarily happy about doing what they're doing. You've got some that are being the cheerleaders for the process and others who are screaming and dragging as you go along. So it has been, leadership has been challenged. Some leaders feel like they're not equipped to give good instructional advice to what's happening because that's not been their world, nor have they received that type of training. They didn't deliver that type of instruction themselves. So they're learning right along with those who are implementing. And it has just been not perfect, but again, given the situation, I commend everybody who's given it the good faith effort, but has it been a struggle with teachers associations? Has it been a struggle with school boards and parents and communities? Yes, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But given the situation and the environment we're in, I will say we've done a pretty good job. Is there learning loss? Absolutely. I mean, I don't know who would think there's not learning loss in an environment like this. But there again, that's the importance of congressional delegates that represent our states at the federal level, understanding this and passing such laws that we're just now seeing. So it's extremely appreciated to hear congressional members support what the practitioners are trying to accomplish. But it has not been, for us who've had a big chunk of our schools in session, it's not been all rosy, and it's certainly not been easy. But I also know too, I feel for those schools who have been out 100%, the frustration involved with that as well. But that too has brought incredible challenges.
Well, Dr. McCormick took my entire answer, so I couldn't agree with her more on how she laid everything out. I will say, however, talk about what has worked. And so the transition has not been easy. And one of the first things I wanted to make sure that I did at the end of last school year was really just listen to my teachers and have them tell me what they needed. I actually hired a friend of mine who was a professional consultant who actually came in and who specialized in online learning and actually did a series of professional developments throughout the course of the first half of the school year to help our students transition. Because when we started to actually, because the year before was more like, okay, let's just maintain, let's just review as we try to figure out the science behind COVID and we try to figure out what the structure of our online learning process is going to be, because it was new. We pivoted real fast, and we had to figure out what to do just to get through the last school year. And that was a matter of the last 3 months of the school year. Coming into this school year, we had to actually, set up the instruction and try to be as effective as we possibly could. And so trying to get teachers to transition through that was incredibly difficult. And I can assure you there were a lot of, tears, a lot of, sharing of feelings and self-doubt. When you have grown men online crying to you through Zoom, I'm sorry it impacts you. Not to say that they can't, but it's just the incredible impact across the board on how emotional people got about this transition was something we had to take into account. However, building up their confidence with the new platform was significant. Really having them collaborate and identify where their weaknesses are and actually what they needed, and then doing everything we could to get those needs met. We had to be incredibly subversive. I have to admit that. I think that it's incredibly important at the local level, again, that we're challenging our leaders and that we're pushing back, and that as leaders in the building that we are protecting, our teachers and our students to actually get the job done. And remember, we're on a singular mission to ensure that if we're taking care of everybody in the building, particularly we're taking care of the teachers, they're going to take care of the kids. And that was incredibly important. We also started a summer program in between, last summer, where we had we had about 30 to 50 of our students practicing online learning so that we can have some feedback going into the next school year. So students can give us feedback on what worked with them in terms of online learning and what didn't work, what was engaging and what was boring, so that we can include that as part of our professional development packaging going forward as well. So I was really happy that we were able to do that with our teachers. But again, the huge level of collaboration that happened between us, our parents, and our teachers going into this past school year really kind of softened the blow. And so once we got past the first few months, our teachers and our students got more comfortable with it. However, again, it still didn't lessen in the amount of the depression and the isolation that was setting in with because again, that was something that was like a sustained environment. It just kept coming and coming and coming. But at the very least, it allowed the opportunity for our teachers to feel very confident about the platform, and having them know that we can get through this together and that we're all experiencing this difficulty together really made it a lot more of a binding experience for our community, because nobody felt alone anymore. You automatically just assume like, oh my goodness, I'm in this by myself and I'm not as good as the teacher next door, when in fact, we're all struggling. And so I think that collaboration really helped a lot. And, again, we also included some very flexible rostering as well, so that we can not only provide opportunities for students to take a break from Zoom, instituting breaks throughout the course of the school day, but also giving breaks throughout the course of the school week that included teachers as well, so that we wouldn't get so Zoom fatigued throughout the course of the school year. So again, that happens as a result of collaboration, listening to one another, and coming together around a common problem. So, and I have a 95% retention rate.
Bravo. I think that's probably uncommon, is my guess. But I did want to talk about the future, like what next school year will look like, especially with Dr. McCormick and Principal Borden. But I think we're going to lose Representative Sherrill in a few minutes. And I know that this group is going to be, the group that's watching this presentation is going to be working on some advocacy work this week and in the future, and also has to advocate to their local lawmakers. And I wanted to just ask you, Representative Sherrill, what are some effective ways to do that? And there's also some questions that came in about what you do. How do you advocate when your member of Congress is not supportive? They don't see eye to eye. They don't necessarily support the president's plan for more funding and more support for education. So what are, if there's some advice or guidance you could give this group, I think that would be very welcome.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just, before I leave, want to say a deep thank you to all of you. My sister is an assistant principal at a high school, so I've had a sort of front row seat to some of the challenges in leadership that we were hearing about as you try to get your staff through just an incredibly unprecedented and difficult time period. when all of our school teachers are just so deeply needed by the community. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's hard to say what next year, what a new normal will look like. I know in New Jersey, our governor has said that we are going to be fully in person in September, which I think I think that's the right move. Just say, here's the goal and we're going to meet it, and now just get to that goal. And I think the reason I'm so supportive of it is because our school should now have the funding to make that happen, and the support and the resources to make that happen. The one area that we've been talking about that is, that I still worry very much about are we going to have enough educators? We have the funding to hire, but can we find those people to hire back? We're missing about 800,000 educators and education jobs compared to before the pandemic across the nation. So, and now we want to hire up. We have money in the American Rescue Plan to actually hire resource teachers to help with the learning loss that we've seen. So not only do we have to hire our base level of teachers, we're going to hire above that. So can we find those people? But I do think it's important. What we've struggled with in getting our teachers back to school in New Jersey is we have towns that run their own district school systems. And so if one town is going back in hybrid or going back full time, and your teacher is teaching in a different town that's made a different choice, that makes it very difficult for our workforce to balance all the different needs they have. Maybe their own children are in virtual learning and they're supposed to go back into the classroom. So what does that do to childcare? So I think the goal to have everyone back in in-person school in September is important. We've got a huge vaccine effort going on like other states. We've put teachers to the front of the line, which is important. And I think we're going to see, as far as high school students, I know my neighbor just got vaccinated. She's 16. And I know studies are ongoing to see if we can't lower that number so that we can get our high school students vaccinated, hopefully before they start school in the fall. That I think would provide another level of comfort to our communities for getting their children back in school. So that's what, we're hoping the new normal is going to start to look a little bit like the old normal, but better. As Biden says, we want to build back better. And then as far as advocacy, that's always been, it's interesting being from New Jersey, because there are certain priorities I have that I would like to see implemented. And we get legislation passed in the House and we're told to get it through the Senate and talk to your senator. Well, my senators are Menendez and Booker, so I could talk to them, but they would just say, we've already done that, and so how do you kind of find and reach out and advocate to those people who disagree with you, like the questioner asked, how do you reach out to legislators who don't agree with you? And there's power in numbers. I think forming groups to really push your issue forward and pushing that legislator to know there will be repercussions at the ballot box if they cannot be supportive of some of the needs of the community. I think we have this really odd thing going on, which is frustrating to me. We passed this American Rescue Plan, no Republican votes for it, and yet now some of them are running on it, and all of the support that they're getting from the American Rescue Plan, which I find ironic, but I'll take it as long as we get the support out to our communities. But as far as advocacy, I think a little bit of numbers, getting a group together to really push on critical issues with your legislator. But thank you all. It's really been an incredible honor to be on here with Dr. McCormick, Principal Gordon. I'm glad to hear you're from New Jersey. I knew there was something about you I liked. And thank you so much for your moderation, Ms. Shah. This was really wonderful and really just an honor to be a part of it. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. I know every minute counts. So
thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And Dr. McCormick and Principal Gordon, I would love to continue on what Representative Sherrill was saying about what the next school year will hold. I don't know if you have some ability to look into the future. I feel like things change day by day. The numbers, the COVID numbers are very erratic right now, and they're just changing. It seems like there's new flare-ups and crises in different parts of the country. But is there something you can prognosticate a little bit about for what the school year will look like, and what permanent changes you think the pandemic will leave? And then I want to make sure we have some more time for the audience questions after you guys can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for us, I mean, I think this pandemic has brought some opportunities that as a lot of leaders have taken advantage of. So I commend folks for that. But our lawmakers in many of our states have also used this as an opportunity to attack the defunding and deprofessionalizing of education. They've also used it as a huge push for choice movement. And that's the reality of it. It's not a secret. It's not that they're trying to hide it. For us, 1/3 of our state funds that are being projected in the budget will go to about 6% of our kids. So fiscally, our public schools are taking a huge hit. There was also quite an attack on the schools that didn't open or that opened at a hybrid, and it was relentless. So that becomes that deprofessionalizing. We say when you defund schools, it impacts educators' life outside of school. But when you deprofessionalize, it really tries to crush what you're trying to get accomplished in school. And the combination of that is not good for anyone, especially kids. And so that piece of it has got to settle down. The other thing that Indiana is going to find a challenge, and across the nation, we're all experiencing this. It just alone service about under 1.2 million students in Indiana, and we had around 15,000, give or take a couple thousand, of students who we could not find. And so when I say we could not locate, that means they weren't returning calls. They're not showing up on any school's STN, which is how we track them here in Indiana. They're not being funded. We don't know necessarily where they are. We are hoping those students show back up or that they're in our neighboring states or other states' school systems, but we don't know that because our nation doesn't talk school to school or state to state. But locating those kids, motivating those online learners who weren't getting much done, but kind of like not getting out of bed. How do you get those kids back in the groove of school? How do you reprogram families to understand rigor and expectations, and what does that look like? Knowing that schools are adjusting some of their programs and are being very smart about this is an opportunity to look at some things. But there will be some challenges associated going forward. But I just can't emphasize enough, not the little things, it's the big things like where are these kids? And how do you reconnect with families and reprogram, for lack of better words, into those expectations? And so I think that will be a big chunk of it. I commend a lot of our schools have some great ideas for next fall, but my husband's an administrator and he reminds me daily, like, get with the program, Jennifer. There's a realistic side of this as far as our daily lives, and don't sugarcoat it. So it's been extremely difficult. I understand that, but I think there's just a lot of complexities to this that cannot be missed, or we're all going to pay for it for decades going forward.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. One of the challenges that's happening is that we have schools that have attendance rates that are below 50%. We have high failure rates that are happening in a number of our schools. I think that it's important that we start paying attention now and going into next school year, figuring out what layers upon layers upon layers of support, remediation, and assistance we can provide those students that have been unmotivated, that have been disenfranchised as a result of the pandemic, and those who have really just been, unfortunately, out of the loop. But I also believe too that despite those challenges, if we can make sure we take those challenges head on and that we have resources in place to support them, we also have the opportunity to really learn lessons from this and really use this as an opportunity to know that we can take this time now to be innovative. So one of the things that I know that has been really helpful and motivating for myself is taking a look at the amount of teacher leadership facilitated as a result of this pandemic, because we have to lean on one another. And as the administrator in the building, I also have to lean on a lot of our teachers leading in different areas, where our teachers, for example, developed their own advisory program where they made it into a case management time throughout the course of the school day, because previously in our contract, it was in question as to whether or not it was something that was a duty, and we weren't using that time very effectively. But because of the pandemic, the teachers now created a case management system through advisory, where now they had an opportunity to really track every single student every single day and keep in contact with the parents on a regular basis and share information on a regular basis with one another. And then they use that information to create their own grade group meetings, or the grade level meetings where they talked about students on a consistent basis. This was developed by teachers, and this was teacher leadership being developed during the course of the pandemic. So that's something that's, again, another innovation that I didn't have to fight for. It was something that just naturally and organically emerged as a result of the collaboration in our building. We also have an opportunity to understand that, being within four walls is not something that's always necessary for us to find success and find flexibility with our students. We have the opportunity to create programs and collaborate with organizations outside of our building. One of the things that I'm opening up and stressing a lot is really the collaborations with a lot of our local universities and insisting on them allowing our students to actually visit campus and take coursework on campus at a higher rate. Because it was something that was very specific where you did dual enrollment and usually it would happen in your own building. But now, if we want to encourage students about taking a look at the future, they have to be able to be inside the environments that they want to be in to determine whether or not if that's something that's of interest for them and whether or not they find that to be very engaging and motivating for them to strive for. So getting the universities to open up their campuses and allow students to take classes with college professors and with college students sitting next to them is something that is already in a development with us, where students will now have an opportunity to be able to just take a field trip, every week, every other week, and take a course, take coursework on college campuses. So where one day out the week could be a remediation week, or it could be a week of support. It could be a day of support. Excuse me. It could be a day where these classes are happening for some, and then for those students who are not interested in the college, there's an opportunity for a lot of workforce career development as well. So there are just so many things that we have learned from this pandemic that has allowed us the opportunity to really create and to be innovative. And we have to take advantage of those lessons right now, because if we don't, again, we've missed an opportunity, and the only person who's going to suffer is our children, and we're going to find ourselves to be right back where we started. One of the biggest things that concerns me the most about this pandemic, and even with the funding issues that have been discussed today, there's been some rhetoric out there that talks about that in order for us to resolve the problems that are happening with our students in our schools is to just get us back in person and get us back to normal. Well, we can't just get back to normal, because getting us back to normal is getting us back to the place we just left. And we just understood that where we just left was already inequity existing institutionally throughout the course of a lot of our school districts. So this is not about getting back to normal. This is about us getting back to normal and then build back better, as the mantra has been said, to figure out how we can build a better mousetrap when it comes to our schools and make it more innovative and more specifically motivating and resourceful for those students who have been underserved for decades and decades.
Thank you so much. Just one real quick answer for Natalia Allen, who asked about whether this presentation will be available as a recording afterwards. Yes, it will be. Registered attendees should get a link to the recording when it's all over. I did want to ask, there was some question from Addie Kaufman and Stacy Cooper. They were talking about teachers' mental health as well as students' mental health. Teachers' mental health has also been affected by all of this. And, there likely will be demands for some kind of summer enrichment. We talked about that, and Representative Sherrill talked about money being available, or hopefully being available with some kind of clear regulation by the summertime. But teachers have had a long year already. So how do we address some of those things? We just have a couple of minutes left, but if there's any way either of you could shed some light on, first of all, whether any of the money that's been allocated by the federal government can be used for teacher mental health issues, and what to do with the summer when you've got educators that may be exhausted and aren't necessarily able to give a lot more before the next school year starts.
Well, that's my concern when it comes to summer learning, because you have a lot of teachers who are already talking about opting out of offering that support to our students. So that's a huge concern, because they want to really rest. They want to rest their brains. They want to get a break from Zoom, and they really don't want to be involved in that summer learning option that's available. So that's a huge concern. Looking at it as from a district standpoint, in terms of making sure that a number of our students that are behind and that are failing are able to catch up and get back on track as much as they can in preparation for September. So, but one of the things that I've been able to do is I started a mental health program about 5 years ago that was a model for the school district to have actual mental health services happening inside of the school building. So if you can imagine a student coming into school, they go to first period, they go to therapy second period, and then they go to class third period. So they wouldn't miss a beat by having it in the building. And so what we were able to do working with the school district was expand those services to even more students by bringing in a second organization to help take on a lot of our more serious cases. And so what we've been able to do is we may not, again, the federal dollars have not been, clearly allocated as to what we're going to do with that money. But what we've been able to do is use the resources that we currently have in place to allow those organizations to provide us referrals to individuals outside, organizations outside that are helping teachers with any mental health and stress concerns that are happening with them in their personal lives, because a lot of them are really challenged with, I had one teacher who caught COVID and her entire family caught COVID. So the 5 of them were in the house, with COVID, and she had to go asynchronous for a stretch of 10 days just to kind of, because she was not feeling well, and she had to take care of, her daughters, and one of her daughters had special needs. So you kind of make those accommodations that come up. And so, and those are the stressors that happens with our teachers, that you got to give them the space to be able to express how they're feeling. And so even though we weren't necessarily able to serve them directly, I think that's important as a school, that we advocate for our kids and our families, that we are able to refer out services for them as much as possible. It's no different when a kid comes and says that they're having certain struggles with, say, utilities and paying their bills. We advocate and go to city government and advocate and refer services out to our local council person or our local agencies to have them help our families. I see it no differently as how we treat our teachers as well.
Yeah, and I would just add real quick that, many of our districts, exactly what Principal Gordon said, our teachers are spent, whether we want to admit it or not. They are tired. And so many of our districts are outsourcing to some partners for those summer services. Now, I would caution, vet those carefully. You don't want poor quality, and there are some good ones out there. I know Indiana, I see some interesting things happening, which I'm happy to talk to anyone about, but that I see a lot of saying we can't do it internally, we're going to have to rely on partners. The mental health of teachers is real. I think under this under the new dollars with ESSER 1, 2, and 3, since you can use it as any Title 1, 2, 3, 4 impact aid, I think that there are creative ways to deal with that. Those school safety is the first one that comes to mind. If your teachers are not mentally, social, emotional, mentally, their health and wellness is not being addressed, and we're not talking necessarily to the clinical level right now, but some of that you can address at the school level, I certainly think you could do some creative things. On the clinical level, which there are teachers, there are administrators, there just are that are dealing with that. Many of our districts have policies, whether it's state or local, to address what services are available. Now, the quality of those can be interesting, but some of that's already in place. So I would encourage you to talk to your central offices to say, what do we offer for the clinical guidance side, but for the other piece of it, where we're looking holistically, I do think you could use some of those funds in an interesting way to address that. I think it's a great question, and very, I think there could be some creativity with that.
Thank you all so much. I need to hand things back over to Greg Waples from NASSP, but Principal Gordon, Dr. McCormick, and Representative Sherrill, thank you so much for being here. This was a fantastic discussion. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully as your conference progresses, there'll be more opportunity to parse some of this. And I really appreciate being tapped to do this. Thank you so much.
Yes, great. Echoing that, thanks. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nirvi, for moderating this and very insightful discussion today. I've been receiving texts throughout about how much people have enjoyed it, how much they've learned. So thank you all so much. So this is concluding the first session of today's advocacy conference. We will be reconvening at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, so just in 15 minutes here, for Principals Advocate, the next session of the conference. Again, this is going to be a more hands-on interactive session, so you'll be able to turn on your cameras and microphones and interact in that session. So we hope you will do that and join us in just a few minutes here. Please refer to the agenda that I just sent around in the chat or that you received an email before the conference for the separate link to that session. These are all separate Zoom events, so you'll have to click into that link. And we will look forward to seeing you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.